genre of romance comics was created in 1947 by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. Yes, Jack Kirby, he of the Fantastic Four, Thor, and the New Gods, was actually the guy who was primarily responsible for creating this entire genre of romance comics. And their work by Simon and Kirby in comics like Young Romance and Young Love is actually amazing. There's 2 volumes of this material put out by Fantagraphics, both under the title Young Romance. And it is fascinating portrait of the world of America circa 1947 to 1950. These stories don't have like happy endings all the time. They also have a lot of stories about people just kind of wrestling with their lives and wrestling with their problems. It makes for fascinating reading. Just a really great exploration of the genius of Kirby because he was such a great genre-spanning guy. These comics were smash hits. So by 1950, there were something like 24 different publishers putting out romance comics, including EC Comics, Timely, which was eventually Marvel Comics. DC had a line of 4 or 5 romance comics during that time. Those comics were, by the 1950s, the most popular comics sold in America, selling over 1 million copies per month and reaching a group of young girls who they just found it to be perfect entertainment. For 10 cents, you could fall into 4 or 5 different stories about girls who they could identify falling in love and having interesting romances and adventures. But this is the world 60 years ago when there was nothing to really distract you as much from these kind of strange, what we see now as Eisenhower era mechanisms that were imposed upon society. And there were all kinds of different spin-offs from the genre. There was space romance, there was cowboy romance, there was some romance that was a little more harder edged. The genre continued through the 1960s into the early 1970s. Both Marvel and DC continued putting out romance comics until the early 1970s. In fact, in Marvel's romance books, especially in the late 60s and very early 70s, those featured work by people like Jim Steranko, who did one great story for them, Gene Colan, and John Buscema, among many, many others. Of course, now that genre has pretty much died off. You can't really find romance except in a very kind of ironic way. But, you expect that too because, the world has moved on from romance novels in general. See, I've always felt like there's room for this sort of genre of romance books. It seems like there would be a place for a comics line that would explore this material. Actually was an attempt to launch a Harlequin comics in the early 1990s. It never took off. Why shouldn't comics be a good place for people to experience a great rom-com?